Hi folks, welcome back to another episode of Talking Conservation. In this particular episode, we're going to build on all the previous episodes that we've done with a really important topic, which arguably we should have done first, maybe not, I suppose, but it's something that's really important to consider when talking about anything to do with applying something to a building. And that's to do with the substrates. So we've talked about different lime plaster mixes, we've talked about render mixes, we've talked about mortars. This bit is all about the really important stuff that goes underneath that, which all forms part of the system. You can have the absolute perfect mix and you can say, that's exactly what I need for my building. But if you've slapped it on the wrong background, it will just fail. And so that's what this episode is going to pick up on, about understanding all of those bits. Now, first of all, we need to understand what we mean by substrate. Stephen, what is a substrate? Tell us all about it.
Well, here we need to go back to our schoolboy Latin, because substrate, sub means under, strata means layer. So it's the under layer. It's what's beneath the surface, beneath the plaster, beneath the render. However, what's important here to remember is that it's not just that immediate couple of millimeters or centimeters, it's actually the whole wall thickness. It's important to remember that whatever we're putting on the surface is the final layer of that whole wall. And therefore, it's important in terms of the moisture behavior and the permeability and how that wall functions. So it's all about moisture, bonding, long-term performance. We're going to touch on all these different bits as we go through. So that's a very quick overview of substrate. Anything to add there, Rich?
No, I think it's really useful to understand that when we're primarily talking about when we're applying things directly to the substrate, because there will be circumstances where that's not appropriate and actually you almost need to build off the substrate. So in other words, you need to build a cavity wall or something, or build away from it. We're not going to cover that here, but we might cover some of the reasons why you would consider that. So primarily for this episode, this is about applying things to the substrate itself.
You mentioned there about different materials and how some of them will not receive a finish directly. So, for example, with solid masonry, we can think of stone like granite, which is very hard, and you'd find it very difficult to get more or less anything to stick to it. And that's why you'd often find that there'd be a cladding or an internal lining rather than the material stuck straight to it. Now, on the same sort of principle, you could argue, well, what about flint? Because flint is a very hard stone. But of course, with flint, it's very small sections surrounded by mortar. And so when you're looking at the overall area that you're dealing with, a far lower proportion is the flint itself. And so provided you rake out the mortar, you can get a good key, you can actually render over flint. However, flint is nearly always used as a decorative finish. So why would you render it anyway? So in actual fact, most flint you wouldn't see rendered. But anyway, but moving on. So solid masonry, you've got brickwork and we've got stone. And within stone, we've got limestone and sandstone, and they're different in themselves. Now, I'm not saying you can't render onto sandstone, but lime can have an impact on sandstone because there's the lime runoff can have an impact that erodes the sandstone quicker than if it wasn't there. Now, when it's completely covered with the render, it's not so much of a problem. But there are issues to think about. So what is behind is important. So solid masonry, you've got to understand the wall, its makeup. But then you've got other materials, and we've got rough rubble. We might have a rough rubble stone material, and it's not necessarily solid, because most rubble stone walls comprise of an outer stone wall, an inner stone wall, and a middle that is rubble, lime, earth, clay thrown in just to fill the gap.
A few dead cats as well,
I'm sure you'll find many different things in there. I'm in some walls in the past where I've been dealing with a thicker brick wall, where the core again has been filled with rubble, I found old bricks from a previous building on that site. And actually they were window bricks, a brick window, and they were quite useful in telling us what used to exist on that site because we had no other clues. But yeah, they threw anything into these voids. So again, understanding your building, understand what the wall is. And then we've got cob and earth walls, different yet again, maybe solid, but that's a very different structure that you're dealing with. And then, of course, we've got wattle and daub. Often with timber frame buildings, you'll have an infill of wattle and daub that you'll have to go over. And then in later years, you'd have lathandplaster with timber, lathandplaster. And of course, you've got the timber frame itself, going over a timber frame. So we've got all these different materials that both react differently with a lime, but need different considerations, need different types of applications to get the limerender, the lime pointing, whatever you're putting onto that building to stay where you want it to stay.
I think it's also worth pointing out that whilst these buildings have been around for many, many hundreds of years, some of them, they've evolved so much throughout that time as well, that on a particular elevation, you might be talking with or dealing with several different types of substrate on that same elevation. So for example, with the timber frame building like you mentioned just now, you might have some original wattle and daub panels that are still there. You might have brick infill, but they might be completely hidden behind a render of some sort over the top. So even when you're doing repairs to a building or even looking at what is the correct render to be used on it, you might be having to consider several different types of substrates on the same elevation. And that really adds to the complexity of what's going to work with each.
Very much so. I think we're going to talk a little bit later about those different layers of materials and how to deal with. I think it's important that we now think about the behavior of the different substrates. And seeing as this involves a bit of science, I'll hand over to the resident geek. So, Rich.
Well, we've geeked out a lot on the previous episodes with regards to things like the vapor permeability, the hygroscopicity, the capillarity of all these different materials that we're using to apply to the buildings. Now, those are all just as important when we're considering the substrate itself as well. So Stephen mentioned earlier on about the porosity, for example, of a granite block, which is not very porous at all. So that's going to have a huge impact in terms of how, for example, if you tried to apply a lime plaster onto a granite block, for example, or even onto a piece of flint, it's really going to struggle because of two main really important characteristics here. And this is to do with a mechanical key. So in other words, how it physically grips and hangs onto the wall versus a chemical key. So in other words, does it absorb into it and does it react with the wall in such a way that it almost chemically sticks and adheres to it? And so both those characteristics are really important when we're considering substrates and the material we're going to apply to it. So for example, how a material adheres to both stone and or brick and timber is all different. So for example, with timber's not very good at clinging on to a lime, for example. And so you actually need more of a mechanical key, which is often why you'll see in timber frame structures, both internally and otherwise, when we've tried to apply a lime plaster finish to them, the previous or the tradespeople have actually gone with a hatchet. What in fact, what's it called, Stephen? I can't remember the name of the
Usually an adze.
Adze, that's the one. Yeah, an adze, where they've physically hacked sections of it and actually made sort of chunks of timber to actually add a little hook that the plaster can grip onto as you're doing it. So that's creating a mechanical key onto an otherwise what would be a relatively smooth surface of the timber just to make sure it sticks to it. There is also other risks as well with regards to the differential of movement with temperature of each of these things. So if you have a particularly rigid system like a cement, for example, and then you've got a flexible timber frame building, they will differentially move with the seasons and the temperature, and therefore you're going to have differences in how they move and whether they give the ability to move, which again is all to do with whether or not it lets in moisture into cracks and those sort of things. So it's matching your substrate to your applied finish is really important to make sure they interact well with how the building's naturally moving throughout the seasons as well. And again, you've got the other difference with different absorbencies. Some substrates are highly absorbent, and if you apply a finish to it which is not very highly absorbent, there's going to be a differential in interaction. The aim being here that you want to try and create that capillarity pathway. So in other words, the tiny little pores and straws where if moisture does get in, they're almost continuous, so they are allowed to then evaporate naturally throughout the whole building substrate. You don't want to where there's a great mismatch of capillarity, because that's when you can get an interface where lots of moisture builds up. And as we know, moisture buildup results in damp and mold and various other issues. So it's all about matching the two together, which is really important. I think a useful analogy I make is, imagine you had a gloss paint, for example, and you wanted to paint it on a pane of glass. First of all, you're going to use a particular primer that really sticks to that glass in a both either mechanical or in a chemical way. Then you paint your gloss paint over the top. You're not going to use the same thing if you wanted to paint a dry sponge. You know, the whole point is you've got to match the undercoat or the underlay to try and do the things, because obviously that sponge is very different to a piece of glass, and if you want the longevity of that finish that's going to be on it. Stephen, I'm sure you've come across lots of examples of this where it's not matched correctly.
Hell, yeah. I mean, a prime example, a cement render on a timber frame. A number of years ago, I was called in to advise a pub where they had a major damp problem at one gable. It was exposed. It was facing south, this gable, so it was exposed. It was in the fens, so lots of weather hit this south end of this building, and they had a problem inside. So I went there and I looked and I said, "You've got more of a problem than dampness here." And they said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, you've got active death watch beetle." And I found one or two crawling across the carpet. And I said, "You've got some cracks there, and they're recent. I think this building's got some serious problems." The long and short of it was, this was a timber frame that had a cement render on it, and it had a thatched roof with a gable end. And whilst there were no problems at the moment between the thatch and the gable, over the years that had leaked, and it had leaked down into the frame below. Because the frame below was clad with a cement render, that moisture then couldn't get out. And when I said to the builders, "Can you get some of that cement render off so we can see what the frame is like?" When I went back the next day, they stood there rather horrified. And I said, "Why haven't you done much?" And they said, "Because the building's actually moving." And it was, every time they touched it, because they started to remove this render, it had started to lose its cohesion. Basically, the render was the thing holding it up. Pub was still in use. We had to create a false wall inside to support all this structure up. Fortunately, it was a small pub, only single story. And then we had to prop outside to stop it all just falling down. And as we removed the render, we found the timbers were just gone to mush. And in fact, at one occasion, with the conservation officer standing there, the conservation officer was saying, "Well, surely you can repair back to the timber." And we said, "Well, what timber?" And the builder went up and actually touched what looked like a solid piece of timber. And as he touched it, the face just crumbled away. And the conservation officer went, "Oh, yes." And I said, "Well, if you can devise a way of repairing to nothing, please let me know." And in the end, it was all accepted that we actually had to build a completely new frame. It was so badly damaged, and it was live death watch in there. It was an active problem. It just shows you how a cement render can trap moisture, and over not too many years, we're talking about a decade, 2 decades at the most. We're not talking about a long period. It can destroy a timber frame.
And I think that's a great segue in terms of a future episode we're doing on specifically on timber with regard to all the bits and gremlins that munch on it and rot and so forth, where we've got a specialist lined up to talk about that. But that's coming soon. Yeah, but I think we'd probably hammer home a lot about the dangers of cement render on buildings, but timber frame especially, because they can just be so damaging, can't they, in terms of anything getting in behind that cement and not being able to escape. Which I suppose brings us on to, given us an example that you've just given, how do the mere mortals like me make an assessment of the substrate to really understand what have I got so I can make an assessment about what I put on top of it?
Okay, well, picking up on what I've just said, I said that I was called in to look at damp, and the first thing I noticed was death watch. So if you've got a timber frame building, I've often said to clients that death watch is the early warning system for a timber frame building, because If the frame is hidden behind renders and plaster, you can't see it. But if you've got active death watch, you know you've got an active problem, because they will only be munching on timber that is starting to degrade anyway. So I think look for beetle infestation is number one, where you've got timber frame. Look for cracks, because if you've got cracking, again, what is the cause of it? Is it thermal movement? Is it structural movement? Is it something else? But nonetheless, a crack could be an indicator of an issue. So look at cracking, monitor it maybe, look for that. Then perhaps more obvious signs when we're looking at a surface might be salts on the surface. You'll see salts appearing. Now, you may think, well, salts, what, table salt? Well, yes, it is. That's another form of salt. But what does it look like? Well, if you imagine a very fluffy, like white granules, but very, very light. And when you touch them, they just sort of come away very quickly in your hand, but have got that slightly gritty, salty type texture to them. And so it's looking for those salts on the surfaces, because that's an indicator that moisture is evaporating and leaving the salts as a deposit as it evaporates away. So that's an indicator you've again got the probability of a damp problem behind. Then you're looking at delamination. Now, what do I mean by that? Where the surface is starting to come away from behind. Now, this isn't something you necessarily can see, but it is something you can detect. And you might be thinking, well, how do I detect that? And so the easiest thing is to tap. You can tap with your knuckle, but if you've got a large wall, it hurts in the end. So what I would suggest is using one of these. And I'm holding up, for those listening, I'm holding up a hammer. Now, what I'm not talking about is hitting the surface with the hammer end of the hammer necessarily. We call it a hammer test, but it's not about hitting it with a hammer. In fact, what I usually do when I test is I hold the hammer by the head of the hammer and I tap the handle against the wall. Now, if you've got a hammer with a timber handle, that's brilliant, because timber resonates. And as you tap it, you will hear the difference. So if it's hard to the surface and well adhered, you'll generally hear a bit of a ring to it. It will give a bit of a ring. Whereas if it's started to delaminate, you'll hear more of a hollow thud. Now, I believe, Rich, you've done this. It may be in a different context, like your swimming pool, but you've done something like this recently.
Have hopefully we'll add to the video afterwards. So for those that follow my personal Instagram account, I mean, I inherited a very derelict swimming pool when we bought this house, and I'd spent a couple of summers ago revamping it. And one of those jobs was to go around and check the cement render on the concrete blocks that were inside this pool. And what I didn't want to do is go through all the lengths of renovating this pool to then find actually the cement wasn't well adhered to the blocks. So I went round and did exactly this. I did the tap test, and we'll hopefully put some video on, add it to this afterwards. But just like Stephen had mentioned, essentially I was going around and just tapping the cement in various areas. I had no visible defects with them at all. Couldn't necessarily tell whether it was delaminated, but there's a really distinctive noise difference between when it's well adhered, where it just sounds solid. It sounds like it sounds like you're tapping a solid block. Whereas, of course, you hit a bit that's delaminated, and of course there is an air gap between the two, so it sounds a bit more echoey. I mean, it's very hard to describe, really, but it's very distinctive when you're going around and tapping. I can really see the what the render's like at the top, and in some places, like here, as you can hear, relatively sound, good enough for when I put a liner on top. But then you get across to other places and you can actually see the gap. Hear that? Totally hollow. Annoyingly, what that means is that I'm going to have to do this and take probably the top section, top few inches of a render off and re-render it, because that's not going to last, unfortunately. Now, on certain parts of the building, certainly with cement render, that can be quite catastrophic, because it's not very easy to re-adhere that onto the blocks at all. So you've really got to kind of take it all off and then start again. Whereas I believe it can be different with lime, certainly on a lime plaster. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, here, where there are some instances where, especially with hair lime, which we'll cover a little bit later on, where it's got its own intrinsic strength across the whole structure that you don't necessarily have to pull the whole lot off. But we'll probably put some footage on here of me doing it on my swimming pool. So different context, but same technique. So that might be useful.
You raised the point about the decision what to remove, what to retain, etc. But just before talking about that, I mentioned moisture and salts and things, and people might be sitting there thinking, well, how do you know if we've got a moisture problem? I'm not going to sit here and teach you all there is to know about assessing for moisture. And you will hear some people say, oh, you shouldn't use moisture meters. They're not designed for walls and things like that. And that is true. They were never designed for walls. They were designed, especially the original moisture meter, they were designed to test moisture levels in timber. So if you've got a timber frame and you want to know, is there a risk, you can use a moisture meter and find out whether there is a higher reading or a lower reading. What is the risk of there being a problem? And sometimes you can feel whether it's damp. A wet surface is a cold surface. A dry surface is a warm surface. So thermal imaging can help you find wetter or theoretically wetter areas. And bear in mind, we're not necessarily talking about just whole wall areas. We can be talking about areas that are very remote and isolated. So, for example, if you've got a leaking pipe somewhere, it could create a damp problem in a very isolated area. Now, if you've gone along thinking, oh, there's nothing wrong with this wall, it looks fine, and you start applying your new limerender to it, but there's an area that actually you didn't realize was excessively damp because of this leak, it'll never go off. You'll have this problem with this patch that'll never go off. So it is worth getting that moisture profiling done. Anything to add on that, Rich?
I think the only thing I would add is that, I mean, I saw this for myself in my kitchen where I had a very old damp problem with a gypsum plasterboard, high ground levels outside. In fact, there was a decking outside. And so a number of different factors that I put down in terms of why I think it was particularly wet there. When I then applied the traditional non-hydraulic lime render on the outside, I mean, I don't do plastering, but I got a plastering to do it. The scratch coat, it was really interesting to see just how long it took to dry. And actually you could see this band of moisture across the bottom of it. And it took a lot longer for that to actually dry out. And you could actually almost see it sucking the moisture and drying the wall out at the time. I mean, we're getting a bit off topic here, but I could tell that the substrate and where the wetness was just by the same lime plaster going on there and how long that particular area took to dry. And you could visibly see the darker patch.
It's an important issue, assessing the substrate, but also assessing what to remove and what to retain. Now, quite often you'll go on social media and quite rightly people will say, oh, cement render is terrible, you've got to remove it. Yes, if we use that as our starting point, cement render, cement pointing are problematic for a building and will cause damage eventually. The question is, are they causing damage now? Is it such that you need to do something now? Now, you may think, well, why are you asking that question? And that's because removing these materials can in itself be problematic. And I think I said when we were dealing with pointing that if you try and remove cement pointing, you can damage the surrounding brickwork, and you can cause more damage than the cement's causing if you're not careful. But the same applies to render. So if you've got a cement render on a building and you've done your hammer test and you've found that some of it is hollow and is starting to debond and come away, and you think, right, well, we better get this render off. That's fine. But what about when you get to that section that is still well adhered? Because you're going to have to get that off now as well. You've started stripping it. You're going to have to finish stripping it, or at least that area. And that's where the problem arises, because in taking that off, you'll probably find you're going to take the face of the brick off as well, or the stone or whatever's behind it. So you need to be aware that the removal of some of these materials can be problematic themselves, and it's not always straightforward. The other thing to remember is that what we're seeing as a cement render on a building, and you think, well, that's a timber frame behind or it's a brick wall behind, we just remove the cement render. But has that cement render been put on top of a lime render, and the lime render is actually still there? Because that again affects the performance of the wall. And sometimes, especially with timber frames, it can be that you can leave that cement render perhaps in place, knowing that there's a lime render behind, because the lime render acts like a bit of a buffer. I say leave it temporarily. It may be that it's not such an urgent job. You must always think that if you've got an inappropriate, incompatible material, at some point it will need removal. The question is when. And that's what we're really talking about here, because if you've got no visible sign of a problem, if you're going around and finding that most of it is well adhered, it's not debonding, it's not hollow, you've not got any serious cracking, you've not got any salts, you've not got any moisture, then yes, you know it's the wrong material, but do you really need to do anything now? And the answer is probably not.
The only bit I would overlay with that ever so slightly is that if it's retaining moisture, then you're just going to have a less efficient wall than it could be, because it could be retaining more moisture. And as you said earlier on, a wet substrate is a crap insulator, essentially, is more heat. So it's just something to consider, is that it might be not cost effective to remove it now, but you're going to be paying more energy bills because of it.
I think you're spot on there, Brett. I totally agree with you. What we're saying, though, is that this becomes a judgment call. Each situation is going to be different. There is no hard and fast rule. In fact, the only rule is there is no rule. And I think in some situations, whilst Rich has done DIY, I've done DIY, and I'd encourage clients to do it themselves where it's appropriate and necessary to do so. And certainly stripping the render when it's necessary is something that people can do themselves if they take care and they know what they're doing. However, the assessment of it and whether it needs to be removed might be a situation where then you do need to call the professionals in to help you to make that decision, to give you the information so that you can make an informed decision. I think there are certain things you can do yourself, but I think there are certain situations where you need the assistance of a professional to help you come to the right decision.
Agreed. Shall we move now on to preparing substrates for if you are going to apply a different layer? And in this particular section, I'll talk quite generically about lots of different substrates. Now, this is going to range from both a solid substrate, like Stephen mentioned before, a solid wall, and also up to a timber framed or a wattle and daub or even a lath and plaster, because the general premise of what we're talking here all applies to each of those, which is to do with a number of different things, which is primarily, to start with, dealing with dust or any loose finishes. Just like imagine when you were going to go and paint something, if it's covered in dust, if you start painting over it, what the paint's going to do is stick to those dust particles, which aren't actually stuck at all to the actual surface itself. So the paint comes off with the dust. And so the first thing is making sure it's clean. So clean away any dust and loose finishes. And you often see builders, and I've done this in the past, with a little leaf blower. So actually blowing away the dust if you're doing pointing or if you're doing before you're rendering, just to make sure you've got no loose finishes to it, that it's not going to stick on otherwise, because that's going to be a barrier to good adhesion, both mechanical and also chemical adhesion. The next one, this is primarily to do with more the kind of wet applicating layers, so things like plasters and renders, is wetting down. Now, this is for a number of different reasons, but primarily it's to reduce the suction of the substrate. So when we spoke before about having absorbent and not so absorbent substrates and materials in the stones, those more absorbent materials, we actually need some of those capillaries on the outer layer of that stone to already be slightly wet. The reason being, if we were going to be applying a plaster or a render to it, which is by in itself a wetter mix, that will actually absorb and suck by its adhesive nature of the capillaries and the pores, will suck the moisture out of that plaster or that render. If that happens too quickly, two things can happen. So one, it can dry out the plaster too quickly, and what that means is that then it can affect the carbonation, because actually carbonation, as we covered in the previous thing, requires the hydrogen atoms from the H2O to actually form some of the carbonation when it reacts with CO2. I'm getting a bit chemistry and sciencey here, but I'll try and reduce that. But essentially, you need a level of moisture to allow the chemical reaction to take place. So you don't want it to be too dry. The other one is if it dries too quickly before carbonation sets in, is it shrinks and it cracks, and you get cracks forming. Of course, that's then a passageway for water ingress, to come in and then make it all wet again. So wetting down is important, and we're not talking about totally saturating the wall either, because a totally saturated wall is going to reduce the ability to get that mechanical grip onto the substrate, onto the brick or the things. So it's just a dusting of spray down with versimils, and it's different depending on what mix you're doing and depending on what substrate you're using. So it's the right level of wetting down, and the professionals will know what that is. I won't know what that is because I'm not a professional in terms of applying these plasters. It's just knowing that you've got to wet it down. Then we're on to let's say, applying the scratch coat. Now, the scratching coat, if you like, is the name given because that's the one that you see the scratch marks on it. Now, those for the main reason that, and the scratch marks afterwards, is to provide a mechanical key. And that is, you're looking for the next layer to have something to physically grab onto. So in terms of creating that hook, like I mentioned before with the timber, where the plaster is going to go onto it and be able to grab onto it and then not let go. With the scratch coats, for example, when you're doing a lime plastering, you often do a non-hydraulic lime plaster or a traditional lime plaster in 3 coats. Now, those are in different levels of coarseness. So the idea being that you've got a brick surface, you put on your scratch coat, which is quite a coarse material and it's not very attractive or nice on the exterior. So that coarseness grabs onto the brick itself. Then you have the scratches on it. You then put the float coat on. The float coat is what grabs onto those scratches on the surface. And then finally have the finish coat, which is much, much finer, which is a nicer surface to paint onto on the exterior. And that will then grab onto the float coat. So you're going in ever decreasing levels of coarseness, but ever decreasing levels of mechanical grip. If you try to go straight onto your brick with your finish coat, it won't stick. It will fail because it doesn't have the mechanical grip strength. That's the reason why you've got it built up in those layers. The next thing to do with this surface preparation is to do with the hair mix. So often with a render and certainly with a plaster, you chuck in loads of hair. Now that can be, as we covered before, it could be goat hair, horse hair. And under the microscope, when you look at these hairs, they've actually got lots of tiny little spikes on them. So they're actually, when the plaster goes off and sets, it grips onto these hairs and they essentially create a really widespread lattice that helps bond and keep all the plaster in place. Without the hair, it actually will still adhere and stick to it, but then you've got much more risk of shrinkage that I mentioned before in terms of if it's drying out too quickly, but also the structural movement I mentioned earlier with regard to the different substrates moving. What this hair does is allows a bit of movement between the hairs in this lattice pattern to actually maintain on the wall. So hair is very important. And Stephen, I know you've come across some instances with hair failures, so to speak. Not this, but to do with on a wall.
Yeah, yes. The thing is that we often forget that hair, although it is quite a robust material, it can be broken down by the alkalinity of lime. I mean, think of the bodies under the patios that you throw the lime in to get rid of the bodies, and it breaks down the hair and as well as everything else. And therefore, if you're not careful and you mix your hair into the lime too early and you leave it too long, the hair will actually degrade and it'll disappear. And this is perhaps more of a problem with a pre-mix where you buy it already mixed, because what you should be doing is buying additional hair to mix in just before you apply it, because some of the hair that would have been put in wherever it was made will have been destroyed. And I've come across that many times over the years. But the other problem is people are just too scared to put too much hair in. And it's surprising how much hair you need to put in. It's almost as if you put the hair into the mix and say you're using a bucket, you throw your hair in, you mix it in, you throw your hair in, you think, oh, that looks enough. If you can still see the lime, you haven't got enough hair in there. You need to put more in there until it's almost, you think, oh, I've got too much hair. And of course, when you put it on, you get a very hairy finish. So if it's outside, you may not want to worry about it. But if it's inside, you might want to go over it with a shaver or something to get rid of the bits up once it's set. But no, seriously, not enough hair is often a problem.
Thanks, Stephen. So the other bit that we're talking about, preparation of the surface. So that's all preparing the substrate before you apply the stuff. It's just a little bit to consider actually once you've applied the application of plaster or render otherwise. And that's also to do with the suction. So this is to do with, again, as I mentioned before, making sure it doesn't dry too quickly for all those reasons I previously mentioned. Now, exterior, we've got the weather to think about. We mentioned on a previous video about the frost protection before carbonation happens. But also we've got to think about the wind as well. Wind really accelerates evaporation. And therefore, we've got to make sure that we protect it from both wind and also wind-driven rain because we don't want to get too wet. Some of the ways that several builders do that is by hanging sheets in front of the render when it's been done. This can also be done internally as well, because it's all to do, what we're talking about here is the monitoring of the environment or the climate that it's going to be going off in to make sure it's given the optimum scenario to be able to let that carbonation and or hydration, if you're using a natural hydronic lime, take place. So this is to do with whether you hang hessian that can be wetted down on the exterior, and also not using things like a dehumidifier inside, because that can dry the air out too quickly. And again, you get more shrinkage there. Slightly differently to perhaps a gypsum plaster, where actually you're trying to almost accelerate that hydration process. It's not the same with a lime plaster. You can't really accelerate it too much. So certainly when you're lime plastering inside, I remember doing the ground floor of my house here in sort of April time, perfect conditions to a certain extent, fairly warm day outside, keep the windows open, gentle background heat in the room, but not forcing the drying out too quickly, because again, that can cause issues with having the same as having a too dry substrate. But I know there have been some comments on a previous episode we did about some of the things that we're using to hang on the outside of a building to protect the renders. And Stephen, you were mentioning about the use of hessian, different types of hessian versus some of the other materials that builders are using these days.
Well, yeah, I mean, hessian is obviously the one normally recommended. That comes in different grades, and people are often tempted. They go to the builder's merchant and say, "How much?" And they get the cheaper grade. That's not necessarily a good idea. You want the thicker, heavier hessian, and you just need to make sure it's properly hung. But we had a comment from I've got it in front of me here on one of the other videos we did. This is the part one that we did about mortars, mortars for building and pointing. And the chap wrote in and he said that hessian doesn't give enough protection in his view, and his company now use recycled packing blankets as used by furniture removal companies. Now, I happen to be talking to a plasterer recently, who we're hoping to get on to talk about decorative plasterwork in a future episode. But I asked him about this, and he said, yes, hessian. He always uses hessian, but he has heard that some people have problems. And so long as it's something that will, in the summer, allow you to hold some moisture in that material to create a moist atmosphere behind it for the wall face, but in the winter prevent some of that cold getting to it as well, because we're trying to protect it from frost. If we're getting into the late autumn period, you don't want frost to affect it, so you want it to be protective in that way. And that's why some of these people are now preferring other materials to hessian.
The other challenge with that, of course, is that by using these slightly thicker fabrics, is especially when they're wetted down, is they're blooming heavy. So what you hang them on, and I won't mention any names here, but I have come across someone who had a bit of a calamity recently, always used to cling their hessian to the gutter, and of course all the gutter came down because of it. So imagine hanging up some blankets on top of that as well. Not so great, but just another consideration that I think people have got to go into with how you hang this stuff. I think ultimately when we're talking about substrates, the two elements we're talking here are the mechanical key and the suction bond, and those are two things, because when a lime carbonates or when it goes off, it actually ever so slightly shrinks. So let's think about when we're talking about a lathandplaster. So you've got the plaster laths, and you squeeze the actual plaster through to actually create that nib, that hook around the back of the lath. when it actually goes off, it ever so slightly shrinks, which is what creates that mechanical grip and as well as a suction bond onto the laths themselves. So we've just got to consider the substrate always in terms of whether it's purely mechanical, whether it's a suction bond as well, in terms of how we prepare the surface to make sure that it all adheres together. Stephen, anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I think when it comes to lath and plaster, which actually we're going to deal with in a separate episode when talking about other matters, but when you're dealing with lath and plaster, you've really got to make sure that the plaster, haired plaster, is pushed through to give a really good nib. I think the next thing we need to talk about, though, and I think with many people, they're going to be sitting there thinking, well, what about my building where there have been modern interventions and where I've got a different mix of different things on my building? It's not always straightforward. Cementitious backgrounds, gypsums, and cement tanking. So, Rich, what's your take on these?
Well, I think the primary thing to remember here is thinking back to our previous episodes in terms of what the performance of the building needs to be. If you've got those layers, as you were saying before, whether or not those layers need removing is a separate sort of debate and a discussion in terms of the pros and cons of doing so. But there is absolutely zero point in adding an impermeable or high performance or lime type layer over the top of something that is impermeable. So if you've got a cement render facade, for example, and you've heard on the internet you need to get a lime render and you stick a lime render on the top of it, you might get it to stick, but it's doing absolutely bugger all, quite frankly, for actually the performance of the building. So I think that's the main thing, really, which is understanding what the substrate is and what's already been applied to that substrate to now make up the substrate, and whether or not you need to go back a couple of layers before you start building up again. So how do you know what you need to remove then, Stephen?
Well, that's always a problem, isn't it? Apart from the tests and the things we've already spoken about, there are a couple of things that come to mind when we talk about removal of material. The first thing is that quite often with historic buildings, you do find all these different layers. And what you should be careful of is taking off a historically important layer. So if you've got a cement render on a building and you find it's on top of a lime render behind, then the temptation is just say, oh, we'll just take the whole lot off. But are you actually destroying something that, number one, doesn't need to be removed, but might be historically important? So there it is a case of, it's like an onion. You peel the layers off one at a time. So if you are removing things, bear in mind that what you see on the surface isn't necessarily the same all the way through. And it might be like an onion, various layers, and you need to peel one off at a time to see what you've got next. But there are situations where I've had clients where I've said, look, you've got a cement render on this wall and it really needs to come off. There's a major problem of dampness at, say, ground level. Upper level's not so bad, but at ground level it's bad. And really the best thing is just to take all the render off and re-render it. And the client has come back and said, actually, I can't afford to do that. Simply, I haven't got the money. What do I do now? Well, in those situations, and again, we have to start by saying what is the correct thing to do. The correct thing to do is take all of it off where you've clearly got a problem. And as we said earlier, that's a judgment call, but assuming that the advice, the judgment is, it's got to come off. But you then say, well, I can't afford to do all that. So what do I do now? Well, in the situation I've just cited, where it was the lower level that had a damp problem, and it might have only extended a metre and a half up the wall, something like that anyway. And in those situations, I've sometimes said to clients, well, why don't you cut off the render at about a metre and a half up, create a nice bead, a nice edge to the bottom of the old render, maybe even put a beading along it to throw water off. And then below that, either leave it exposed. That's one option. Just leave it exposed until you can do the whole thing. Or if it does need to be covered, put your lime render on the lower bit. And that creates the lower permeable layer that you need, with the upper layer being the cement render. You may then say, well, isn't that a bit of a strange mix? Well, yes, it is, but it's a compromise. And I don't think we should be afraid of compromises because of financial reasons, because of practical reasons. Sometimes these compromises are necessary. Would you agree, Rich?
I would. I mean, you then throw into the extra complication of if the building is protected in some way legally, whether it's in a conservation area or if it's listed, then of having to have that discussion with the conservation officer in terms of understanding both for performance reasons of doing this, but also the aesthetic, which has to be balanced, like you were saying. So it's not particularly easy. I think the other bit that I'd like to throw in the mix here is in terms of how people can deal with when you've got later additions or extensions, for example, to an old building and how they interact with different phases of development. So, for example, if you've got an older building and it's got say, a limerender on it, and it's whether it's in good or poor quality, and then you've got permission to build an extension on the back. Well, that extension is going to be built in a very, very different manner to which the original house would have been built. It's going to be, for example, cavity walled, maybe with block work. You're unlikely to going to use a lime render on the outside of that because it's going to interact differently with the concrete blocks. So you probably will use a more modern equivalent. So you use a modern cement render. Absolutely fine for the modern building. How those two interface when they join, though, that can be really challenging, both from an aesthetic perspective, but also from a performance perspective. So different phases and changes of ownerships can have an impact on how the building looks. And what's often happens with those sort of things is to try and make it all match in. We then find that people then use the same render or same coating across the whole building, maybe at a later date. So new ownership comes along and thinks, oh, I don't like the way that I can see the extension there. I'll slap a load of this masonry paint over the two because then you can't see where they join. And then we get into the problems of different performance for different parts of the building. And well, as you were saying earlier on, there are different materials being developed for that very reason. You were mentioning one earlier on.
Yeah, we were chatting before we started recording, and I was mentioning that there have been various hybrid lime washes created for this very reason. Years ago, I dealt with a building where we had to lime wash it, but there was one section where there was a concrete column, at the end, and the client wanted it all the same color. Now, there was no way lime wash was going to stick onto the concrete, but I wasn't going to use, an external masonry paint on the lime wash. And I happened to find that there was a manufacturer that was created a modified lime wash. In fact, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it was PVA they put in the mix or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, it was something they added to it. And it meant that the lime wash could be used on the concrete. It may not have been ideal, but it would stick on it and it gave the same color. So there you were able to use the same color. But, and there are, I think my example was from quite a few years ago, and there are paint manufacturers now that create paints that can be used on different materials. So one manufacturer I have come across and used is Keim. It's a German manufacturer of a paint, Keim, and they create a mineral paint. And I'm not suggesting this is ideal for all situations, but I've used it where we've got mixed lime and cement renders. I've also used it where we've found that lime wash just would not work on the lime because of the orientation of the building. And it was getting a lot of algae on it because of the orientation and performance in that particular area. We just could not get lime wash to work. And in the end, we went to Keim and we used Keim on it, and that did work. So it is a matter of finding out what you've got. Sometimes a bit of experimentation may be, but be careful with that. But it can be a matter of compromise as well. So, yeah, it is a challenge. But there are materials out there that can be used in these situations. Yeah.
And I think with each of those materials, it's like, just like you say, it's understanding the balance of aesthetics and performance. So if a lime wash, as we know, has the highest performance, but if it's not going to work in terms of moisture, but if it's not going to work on it from an aesthetic perspective, because it won't bloom and stick or otherwise, then it's where on that scale do you go between we're losing some performance here, but it's going to be good enough, I suppose. And that's with all the things we're discussing, really, isn't it? So with the different options that you've got with regard to various paints and finishes, I think this really brings up another hotly debated topic about the kind of conservation approach versus the really pragmatic or practical compromise. And there has been a shift more recently, I suppose, in some uproar in the public about certain buildings adding applied surfaces and coatings and paint to them, whereas thinking, oh no, it doesn't look like an old building anymore. Stephen, give us an example of where you've come across that, because I know there've been a few in the news more recently.
Well, yeah. I mean, someone we know well calls it the fetishization of exposing building structures, and this occurred during the Victorian era. And what happened was they started to remove renders and finishes like that to expose back to the brickwork, back to the stone, and in some instances to expose timber frames. And of course, they were taking these off and saying, oh, what a shame, all these lovely old materials have been covered up. Let's leave them exposed. And so for the last 150, 200 years, we've got used to these buildings being exposed. So when someone like me comes along and says, yes, it's a lovely exposed timber frame, but it was never meant to be exposed, and it's not doing it any good being exposed, it's actually deteriorating more rapidly because of that. And therefore, we want to render over it. We want to cover it up. Or even if we don't render over it, we might want to paint the panels and the timber all with lime wash so that the whole thing is covered in lime wash. And that can cause uproar. So an example I dealt with many years ago in Lewis on the south coast, we had a lovely timber frame, a jetted building. We'd done all these repairs, done the lime rendered panels, and it was down to the final finish. And we discussed it with the client, who was quite happy with the idea of putting the lime wash over the frame and the panels. The conservation officer thought it was great. So we did that. And the client wanted a nice light ochre colour. So it wasn't white, it was light ochre. So we got the builder to put it all over the timber frame, panels, everything. Now, previously, this was a typical black and white type building. You know, the sort of thing I mean. A little while later, the client phones me up and she says, oh, you're in trouble, Stephen. I said, what do you mean? Well, you're not popular in Lewis anymore. I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, in the newspaper, there's now a campaign about our building, how we've ruined the building by changing the appearance. And she said, I've actually had some people come in and tell me off in the shop. And she said, and some people are saying, well, I'll never go in there again. And so this was a number of years ago. So I've personally experienced, not anyone having a right go at me directly, but there was a case where we did the right thing, but it wasn't popular. And of course, this has occurred recently. We see in the news, and I've got it up in front of me here, it's the Yorkshire Dales. The village of Askrigg was divided after the medieval church tower was rendered white. And it's caused an absolute uproar. This is from ITV, so it hit the national news. You see, a lot of people don't realise that the exposure of these buildings occurred during the Victorian period, and it can cause technical problems, especially with timber frames, but also with stone, with brick and what have you. And now, 100, 150, 200 years later on, we're having to seriously think about going back to a rendered finish, or at least the lime wash finish, to protect the building. But it can cause this outcry because we've changed the appearance.
I mean, it's amazing how both this is the fashion. I mean, let's face it. Let's not kind of beat around the bush. This is a fashion thing in terms of what we see as being old and picture as being old. And both the Victorians and the Georgians had in their head of terms of this is what we want to see. We want to see this building structure because that looks old. But there's a very different world of the fashion of what looks old and what we want to call heritage versus the really technical side of things in terms of how to preserve these buildings. And there's definitely a valid argument there. I mean, one of the things that a little kind of pet peeve of mine is the current industrial look of buildings. So again, we go back to the exposed brick side of things. And you can't really walk around any new pub or something that's being opened at the moment where they're stripping all the plaster off the walls and having electrics running copper conduit and stuff, and just basically looking at the skeleton of what would be a room. And that's kind of like the in vogue fashion of the industrial look. But people in their homes now having chimney breasts with exposed brick because it looks old and original, authentic. It's like, well, okay, it's fashion. It's entirely up to the homeowner's choice, but it never would have been that way. Only the poorest of homes couldn't plaster or lime wash their walls.
I'm laughing slightly because what you can't see is I'm sitting in my office, which is an extension on the end of our house where there was an external chimney stack. And when we did it, I didn't bother plastering this wall. So I've got an exposed brick wall facing me here.
But that's that. I'll be honest though, that's an extension. That's different to people that are actively stripping off the plaster off a wall to have it look old. But anyway, it's personal preference. It's entirely up to people what they want to do. But you are creating additional issues when you start doing that, because of course bricks are not designed to be an internal decorative finish. They're dusty as heck, and then you put these different sealants on them to seal them up and everything, and you cause a whole raft of issues. And that's a whole other episode in itself about the hydrophobic brick sealant stuff. We'll leave that for another time. Anyway, I think we've probably covered a lot on this, Steve, and I think it's probably time that we wrap up this particular episode.
Yeah, I think the main message here is to understand your building, number one. And that's the message I bang home with my professional training, and I would with homeowners as well. If you don't understand what you're dealing with, you're going to mess up at some point. So understand the building, understand what you're dealing with. The other thing I would urge is that when you're making these decisions, yes, you can read a lot on social media, including our podcasts and what have you, but sometimes you need to call in those that really do know their stuff. Call in the specialists, call in the professionals, call in the trades, because they are the ones that can help you make an informed decision and not make a mess of things. And the other thing I'd say is that with changing home ownership, it's all very well you doing something because you understand why you're doing it. And you know what that means in terms of future maintenance and looking after that building. But what happens when you sell that property on and the next owner may not understand that? And I'm all in favour of logbooks for houses. I think it's an extremely important thing that we create a record of what we've done and sometimes why we've done it to pass on to the next owner so that they can take on that house with an understanding, and they don't have to go right back to square one, but also they don't make silly mistakes simply through not knowing.
It's a really valid point, because also if you see a render on a particular building, it's incredibly difficult to know whether that's an appropriate render for that particular building and the reasons why the person's put it on there. And you could end up being, like we were saying before, ripping off a particular coating, thinking it's wrong, and actually it's perfectly fine, and the rest of it. So yeah, I think I'm a firm believer of logbooks are a good way forward. I'd like to sort of say, yes, I absolutely agree with that, but I'm thinking of all the stuff I've done to my house and how much have I actually logged down. I suppose it's all on social media. They can look at my social media account and see what I've done. That's my logbook. Okay, well, I think we'll tease on to the next future episodes on this. Hopefully everyone's enjoyed our little dialogue that we've had on substrates and all the things that we'd like to get across. In future episodes, what we're planning on doing is bringing in some of the specialists that we've mentioned here to actually go into further depth on some of the elements that we've covered in these episodes. So things like, for example, we've covered talking about some aggregates and the difference they make to the mixes. So we're going to speak to some specialists about the impact of the different types of aggregates and what they can do to a mortar mix, because that's something else to consider. And possibly even some stuff on decorative plasterwork, and some other experts and specialists that where it might not be applicable to everyone on here, but actually it's just giving you a bit more information about those specific trades. And as Stephen mentioned, yes, there's an awful lot you can do in your own house, but actually if you do want the advice on it, there are lots of different ways you can get that, both on social media, both on or on various websites. But personally, I've set up Expertible. Stephen is one of the experts on there, which is where you can get impartial and independent expert advice. The whole point is they're not selling you their service. They're not selling you any products and things. They're just giving you their advice. So Expertible is how you can go about getting the kind of advice we're talking about on that. Any questions on this particular episode or other ones we've done, stick them in the comments below. And then, Stephen, over to you to final close, please.
So thank you for watching or listening. And we hope you've enjoyed and been entertained by this episode. Please press the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Thank you very much and goodbye. You've been listening to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
With me, Stephen Boniface.
And me, Rich Aylesbury.